We're here on Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, and we are coming to a closure of a gigantic sugya that we started almost a week ago, and that is Rebby Meir, or the Acherim Shita, in a case to distinguish between the following two cases. In a Korban Pesach that was shechted l'shem mulim, the Arelim, it's kosher. Whereas if he started with the Machshava l'shem Arelim and then he had a Machshava l'shem mulim, the korban is possible. And we're holding by Omar Rabbah. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. We are counting down from the top of Samach Gimel, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down. So our goal for today is twofold. Number one, to complete the sugya of the Acherim. And number two, to begin the new Mishna of Shchitas HaPesach and its relationship to owning Chametz. When the Korban Pesach was brought and somebody, we don't know who, but that's what the Mishnah is all about, owns Chametz. So that's what we're hoping to at least introduce today. Amar Rabbah. Lo. There's no need to accept Rava's interpretation of Rebby Meir, that Rebby Meir is based on the fact that Ein l'shchita el basof, and therefore he has two mutually exclusive machshavos that are schal simultaneously besof hashchita, l'shem arelim and l'shem mulim, and therefore Rebby Meir applies the principle of tfos lashon rishon, not midin chazara, but midin seder hachaloyos, that the first chalos is chal because he first enunciated l'shem arelim. Says Rabbi no. Liolam kasavri acher yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'ad sof, which means that we are now challenged to figure out the Acherim according to Rabbah in the case where he started with Arelim and he ended with L'Shem Mulim, and the Acherim say in such a case the Korban Pesach is possible, even though Yeshna L'Shchita Mitchila Ve'at Sof, and there's plenty of room now for both Machshavos to be Chal, because now the Shchita generates a Chalos from the beginning of the Shchita to the end of the Shchita. And therefore, at some point in the Shchita, and it's irrelevant whether it's B'tchilas HaShchita or B'sofa, he had a Machshava L'Shem Mulim. And that Machshava L'Shem Mulim should salvage the Korban, even if he began with a Machshava L'Shem Arelim. When does Rebby Meir apply the principle of Tfos Lashon Rishon? That's only if these two Machshavas are mutually exclusive. They cannot be Chal at one moment. The Sof Shchita, says Rabbi Nen. The Acherim are going to passel the Korban, even if they maintain, the Yeshna L'Shchita Mitchila V'ad Sof. Why? So Rabbah comes up with an ukimta. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a little bit prejudiced. I have almost an allergic reaction to ukimtas. But let's not get upset because we got Abaye coming around the bend with another approach to Rebby Meir. But let's give Rabbah, full attention. Kigon shegomar belibo litravayu. When the Shochet implemented his Shchita, he had in mind both for Mulim and for Arelim. And in and of itself, if that's all the information you provide, then the Korban should be kosher because he had in mind l'shem mulim, and that's going to salvage the Korban. That's the principle of mixtas orla lo basla. But what happened? Hotzi bepiv la arelim. Even though he had in mind both, but let's ask the question, says Rabbah, what did he pronounce? What did he enunciate? And he announced La Arelim. He started the shechita. Shechita takes all told about 2 seconds. And before you could say Jack in the Beanstalk, before he finished the 2 seconds, he didn't say anything. Again, we anticipated that he would say the words l'shem mulin, but he didn't get it out of his mouth on time. So the machsheves Arelim took him from the beginning of Shechita to the end. And in a sense, he messed up over here. If he had really fulfilled his will as he had originally thought he would, then he would have said L'Shem Arelim and L'Shem Mulim before he finished the Shechita. Again, I don't know how you mumble that all out in 2 seconds. But in effect, he missed the boat. Instead of lahaspik, instead of having enough time to declare l'shem mulin before he finished the shechita, he already finished the shechita. So this marbosai is a sugya called piv v'libo shavim. Again, if we had a whiteboard, I would write this on the board. And this principle is relevant to many, many different areas, primarily to Nidarim and Shvuos. Nidarim and Shvuos means haflas peh. What happens if a person has one machshava, one intention, but he expresses himself in a different way? And we have now a conflict between his machshava, which is called the leiv, and piv, what he actually said. One approach is to say, well, you know what? The whole deal is off. Piv is meaningless unless he had leiv, unless that was his machshava's intention. And another approach will say, forget it. I don't care about libo. We don't care about what he had in his mind, in his heart. We care about what he enunciated. Ubaha pligi, says Rabbi, what's the machlok between Rebby Meir and the Chachamim? To Rebby Meir, Savra lo be'inon piv v'libo shavim. We will determine the halacha based on piv, where the Torah endowed the words of a person, the power to generate a chalos. Then let's look at the words and forget about what he has in mind. Again, he had in mind, his plan was to say l'shem mulim as well, but all he said was l'shem arelim. The l'shem mulim came too late after he completed the shechita. The shechita was l'shem arelim, and only l'shem arelim. Hence, Rebby Meir passes the korban. For Abonan Savri, be'inon piv v'libo shavim, you can never determine the chalos based on piv alone without being accompanied by leiv, without the piv being an expression of what he has in his leiv. And I find this fascinating because it's almost a philosophical sugya. You know, it's almost a conflict between the world of Maisa and the world of Machshava. You know, in the Hashkafic works, we divide up the world into different olamos. You know, there's the olam HaMachshava, there's the olam HaMaisa, and in between there's the olam HaDibur. So where does the olam HaDibur belong? Is it a Maisa or is it a Machshava? Just that I express my Machshava. If you hold I need Pivali Machshavin, then my Dibur is nothing more than an expression of my Machshava. It has no independent significance to generate a chalos. His Machshava was l'shem mulim as well, not just l'shem arelim. And therefore the Chachamim will say that it may take a while till we figure out what his Machshava was, and it'll be a little bit late because it's after the Shechita, but he didn't miss the boat because his intention in the Shechita was l'shem mulim, even though he didn't express that. We'll only find that out after the Shechita. Comes along Rebby Meir and he says you can't take his dibur that was post Shechita, l'shem mulim, and now Lemafreya put it into the original Shechita. It was after the Shechita when he said l'shem mulim. So as far as we know, as far as the objective truth of Dibur is concerned, all he said during the course of the Shkita was L'Shem Arelim. And therefore, even if I grant you, says Rabbah, that Yeshno L'Shkita Mitchila V'Yad Sof, that would only mean that he could add the Machshava L'Shem Mulim before the Sof HaShkita. But Imlo Hispik, if he only added that enunciation after he finished the Shkita, goodbye, Charlie, it's too late. You've already established that this Shkita is L'Shem Arelim and Kulo L'Shem Arelim, and we don't need Piv V'Libo Shavim. Now keep in mind that Rebby Meir should not be interpreted as going to an extreme. If a person said something and he didn't have any intention whatsoever, and the Dibur alone is like a robot, it's like an what do they call it, digital sounds, that come from a computer, that's meaningless. But in a case where he said X and he had in mind to say X, but he also had in mind to add Y, then it depends. He had in mind to say both Arelim and Mulim, but he didn't get a chance to say that before the Shkita ended, then we're stuck with a Shkita that was implemented L'Shem Arelim and only L'Shem Arelim. So the Gemara is not happy with Rab. Says the Gemara, because Rebby Meir lo be'ina pivli bo shavin. I'm going to quote to you a Mishnah, an explicit Mishnah in Trumas Perek Vav. Now, this is called a Stam Mishnah, although it has a machlokas, but the first opinion, which we call the Tanakama, is Stam. And we have a rule all over Mishnayos, all over Shas, that a Mishnah that begins with an anonymous opinion expresses the view of Rebby Meir. Stam Mishnah ki Rebby Meir. Even though the Mishnah quotes a second opinion, a dissenting view, the first opinion, which is anonymous, called the Tanakama, is Rebby Meir. What does it say, the Mishnah in the third paragraph of Truma? It says, Amiskave lomar Truma. He looks at his fruits that are tevel, and he had in mind to say that these should be Truma, the Omar, and instead, Nitkal b'diburo. He made a mistake and he called it Maaseh. Or he designated it as Maaseh in his mind, but the Omar Truma. So it's not Piv V'Libo Shavim. What'll it be? If we go Basa Machshava, then you can't say that we're going to shove it down his throat. But if you're going to say we don't need Piv V'Libo Shavim, then if he said Truma, it's Truma. If he said Maser, it's Maser. Another case. Oh, he had in mind to take upon himself what's called Nidre Isur. Nidre Isur means I point to a loaf of bread and I say, Kikar Zu Asur Alai, which means I will get no benefit whatsoever from this loaf of bread. The man looked at a house, pointed to the house, and he said, Hanas Bayis Ze Asura Olai. He really meant to point to a different house. So you have Bayis A and Bayis B. From the perspective of Libo, he wanted to generate an Isur on Bayis B, but from the perspective of Piv, he generated an Isur on Bayis A. Oh, Eini Nene Lezeh, the Omar Lezeh. He said, I won't have Hana from this person, but he really meant in mind a different person. In all these cases, the Tanakama of this Mishnah says, Lo Omar Klum Ad Shiyu Piv V'Libo Shavim. He has to be Motzi Mi Piv Mashagomar B'Libo. And therefore, in all the previous cases, which depend upon Piv, Rebby Meir, because again, Stam Mishnah Rebby Meir is going to invalidate, even though the Piv was okay, because there was no lay. He didn't support what he announced by his lay. So we see, because the stop Mishnah Rebby Meir, that Meir holds that we don't pin down a person to what he said, but rather we look at what he had in mind to say. And we must have piv v'libo shavim, otherwise the piv is not capable of generating a chalos of registry. Therefore, we cannot accept Rabbi's understanding of Rebby Meir, and we're going to say that his piv of l'shem arelim will passel the korban when he didn't have in mind l'shem arelim. He had in mind l'shem arelim u'l'shem mulim. And I think there's a Pesach here. There's a little bit of an opening to defend Rabbah against the onslaught of the Gemara. In the case where he had in mind true when he said Maser, Rebby Meir argues that the L'Shem Maser, or I should say the Dibur of Maser, is meaningless. He did not have in mind L'Shem Maser. So too in the reverse, or in the case where he looked at one bias, he didn't have in mind that bias. He said this person, he didn't have in mind that person. The piv is meaningless. However, in a case where he had not only a machshava, but also a dibur, and he had in mind l'shem arelim, and he declared l'shem arelim, now you want to tell me, but he also had in mind l'shem mulim. The Gemara thinks that if he had in mind l'shem mulim as well, then as far as l'shem arelim is concerned, that cannot register. Because all you can accept from him is you're bound by his libo, and his libo was for both arelim and mulim, which is a valid Korban Pesach. Now you want to tell me, well, he said l'shem arelim, and therefore the Korban is possible. How can you say such a thing? He didn't have in mind a machshava to passel the Korban. He had in mind a machshava that would be kosher. L'shem arelim and l'shem mulim. Comes along Rebby Meir and he says, look, did he have in mind l'shem arelim? The Chacham are going to have to admit that that's true. They can't deny that he had in mind l'shem arelim. He didn't wake up on the wrong side of the bed and say l'shem arelim when he really had in mind l'shem mulim, like the case where he woke up on the wrong side of the bed and he said l'shem truma when he really meant to say l'shem maser. That's not the case we're dealing with. He had in mind l'shem arelim. He shechted the korban l'shem arelim. Now Boker Tov, after the shechita is done, now he wakes up and he says, well, Rabbosai, I had in mind also l'shem arelim. Also l'shem mulim. No go, my friend. Because your machshava l'shem arelim was piv v'libo shavin, according to Rabbah. The Gemara rejects that. The Gemara thinks that even the machshava l'shem arelim was not piv v'libo shavim, because eino dome l'shem arelim u l'shem mulim ki l'shem arelim bilvad. And Rebby Meir and Rabbah understood that the machshava l'shem arelim in and of itself is a viable legal machshava, and he had in mind l'shem arelim, and what happens after the shechita is irrelevant. In any event, the Gemara, having rejected Rabbah, now quotes Abaye. Ella Amar Abaye, I'll tell you what Rebby Meir had in mind. Reisha, in the case where he started with mulim and then arelim, the Amar, he made a declaration. Hareini shochet simon echad l'shem mulim, v'simon sheni l'shem arelim, or af l'shem arelim. In other words, he wants to include in the second simon arelim as well. If that be the case, then Rebby Meir would agree that the korban is kosher. Why? Because we assume that when he declared l'shem mulim on the first simon, he didn't mean that the second simon should not be l'shem mulim. He meant that the second simon, let's add on board the arelim as well. Therefore, simon sheni nami psichi be mulim. Psiche be means it's nimshach. In other words, the second simon can be associated not only with the arela but also with the mulim. Is kumtais that he had both simanim l'shem mulim, but not so in the sefer. In the sefer, diomar siman rishon la relim, and now when he says siman sheni le mulim, he has in mind to add the mulim to the arelim, which means that the first siman was only and exclusively l'shem arelim. So you'll ask me, wait a minute, but the second siman was both l'shem arelim and l'shem mulim because he explicitly declared that the second siman would be l'shem mulim. So it's not kule arla. So the Gemara says, Simon Rishon holo psichi be mulin. And now Rebby Meir holds that a machshava poselis in one simon is enough to passel the korban. And even though in the second simon he had in mind a combo of both arelim and mulim, which in and of itself would not be a machshava poselis, because that's not kule arla, it's miktas arla. But nevertheless, the machshava poselis in simon rishon in and of itself is enough to passel a korban. And this is a gigantic machlokus in the Masechtas Zvachim that we touched upon in the past. Namely, is there pigul in one simon? So, for example, he had in mind in the first simon that the korban would be eaten chutz lizmano, chutz kova, whatever the machshavas pigul was. And in the second simon, he had in mind that it should be bimkomo, bizmano, I'll think everything is kosher. Rebby Meir holds mefaglim bechatzi mati, that there is a machshavas pigul in one simon. And once that simon of shchita was with a machshava mefageles, the korban is pigul, hands down. That's the shita of Rebby Meir. Rebby Meir l'tamei di omar mefaglin bechatzi matir. Just 1 second. I said it was a Gemara in Zvachim. He says it's a Gemara in Menachos. I just want to see the Mesoras Hashas. I'm sorry, this is just my own curiosity here. Where is it? He skips it. Oh no, here it is. Kimmel. Oh, beautiful. It's a Gemara in Zvachim as well. I wasn't misleading you. All right, he writes here it's a Gemara in Menachos, but it's also in 2 places in Zvachim. So I would have said Zvachim and not Menachos. Anyway, so what happens in the sugya of Rebby Meir, mefaglin bechatzi matir? If a person has a machsheves pigul, you know what? Let's start with the pasuk in Chumash. Vayikra Zayin. It says, "V'im hachol yachel mibsar zevach shlomo biyom hashlishi lo yirotze hamakriv oso lo yichoshiv lo pigul yeh v'nefesh halcheles mimeno avonosa tisa." So the Gemara in Zvachim says that this pasuk is talking about a case of a person who had a machshava at the time of the zevach that it should be eaten on Yom HaShlishi, or any korban that he has in mind that the avoda is being done for the purpose of eating the basar korban li'achar zmano. So it doesn't have to be Yom HaShlishi, it could be Yom HaSheni. Im ochal mimenu afilu toch zmano areu chayiv chatos. Okay, fine. V'nechleku chachamim Rebby Meir. I'm just reading the note here. Kishechoshav machsheves pigul bechatzi matir. Klomar. Let's say in Korban Mincha, the sugi of Menachos. B'mincha she'ein shireo mutarim b'achilas konim at she'aktirus hakometz v'salavona. So to be matir, the achilas hamincha, what's called shiori hamincha for the kohanim, you need, number one, a kometz, and number two, aktaras halavona. And he had in mind the machshavas pigul. And when he was maktir, either the Chametz or the Levona, he had in mind that the Kohanim should eat it, tomorrow, and that's a machshavas pigul. So Rebby Meir holds that the mincha mispageles, even though he had a machshava of pigul chutz mano in one of the two aktaros, either in the aktaras Chametz or the Levona. And that's called mefaglim bechatzi mati. And the Chachamim say no. The mincha is only mispageles if he had a machshavas pigul bechol amati, both with the kmitza and with aktaras halavona. And Rabbanan, getting back to Gemara, l'tamayu diamri ein mefaglin bechatzi mati. Just by way of introduction, the Torah says in Perek Lamed Daled of Parsas of Sefer Shmos, Lo sishchat ala chometz dam zivchi. You're not allowed to shech the Korban Pesach if he has chometz in his reshus. And the pasuk seems to be addressing the shochet. So the shochet has chametz in his reshus. And if that be the case, then intuitively we would have said that the shochet, and only the shochet, violates this isur. And the ownership of chametz at the time of shechita depends upon the ownership of the shochet. Hence, the Mishnah says, "Hashochet es haPesach al chametz." The man has chametz in his rishus, a kezayis of chametz, over belosas. He violates the losas of lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af hatamid. Even if he owns chametz at the time that he shechs the korban tamid ben arbaim, again, we're only talking about Erev Pesach, and the tamid shel ben arbaim, you may recall, is shechted before the korban Pesach, that we learned at the beginning of this parak. He violates this law. Okay, we'll get to the Gemara to try to understand why Rabbi Yehuda understands that this lo sishchat refers not just to the Korban Pesach, but also to the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim. Now here I want to add two notes. Firstly, the question that the Mishnah does not address, at least not head on, is whether the other members of the Chabura, other than the Shochet, violate this Isur. Meaning, when the Torah says, Lo Sichchar al Chametz, does it include even Chametz that is in the possession of one of the various minuyim on the Korban Pesach, not in the possession of the Shochet? That's going to be the major issue in the Gemara. Point number two, the Rambam, when he codifies this halacha, he mentions a kezayis chametz, and there's an entire discussion here in the Minchas Chinuch and the Sfas Emes. How does the Rambam know that lo sishchat al chametz only applies to a kezayis chametz? He's not eating the chametz, Rabbosai. He's just possessing the chametz. And not only that, we have the Shita Rabbi Yochanan, which the Rambam accepts at the end of Yoma, that Chatzi Shirosim in Torah. So if he has half a kezayis of chametz, that should be enough to generate malchus for violating the law of shchit of lo sishchat. Okay, so that's a long diun in the Achronim. And there's another discussion here about which pasuk does the Mishnah have in mind. We quoted a pasuk of Lo Sishchat ala Chametz Dam Zivki, which is in Shmos Perek Lamed Dal. But there's an earlier pasuk, which Rashi here doesn't even quote, in Shmos Chav Gimel, and there it says Lo Tizbach al Chametz dam zivchi. Why does Rashi quote the later pasuk and not the earlier pasuk? And the answer apparently is that in our pasuk that Rashi quotes, it says explicitly lo sishchat, prohibiting the shechita. But in the pasuk lo tizbach, the Torah omits the word shechita. And therefore, we're not sure what the pasuk has in mind. He says, pasuk zebefurash, in our pasuk lo sishchat, which is the later of the two psukim, the Torah explicitly prohibits shechita. And that's a reference to the Korban Pesach. And it says, v'lo yolin la boker zevach chag ha-pasach. But in the case of the earlier pasuk, where it says lo sizbach al chametz dam zivchi, it's not explicit that he's talking about an Isur Shechita. Again, what are the other options? I don't know. Okay, Rabbosai, so this is where we're going to stop for today. Only halfway through the Mishnah, but the second half of the Mishnah is really related to a different aspect of the Korban Pesach. Okay, then? So let me take this opportunity to wish everyone. Wanted to point out that Tosfos Divrei Maskal HaShochet on the bottom of the Amud says that which is intuitively obvious, but it should be said that although if the Shochet has possession of Chametz, he violates the law lo sishchat, nevertheless the korban itself remains kosher. And he himself, amongst the others, have fulfilled their obligation of Korban Pesach. However, one of the Achronim is Medayik from Rashi. Later on, we didn't get to the Rashi on Samach Gimel and Beis, that Rashi's of the opinion that the korban itself is possible in a case where the shechita was done while there was possession of Chametz. Now, just to introduce the second half of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon Omer, HaPesach B'Arba'asar, Lishmo, we're talking about the korban that was brought in the afternoon of the 14th. Lishmo means L'Shem Pesach, and therefore the korban is kosher. Chayav, if he owns chametz in his possession, he violates the Isur lo sishchat al chametz am zivchi, and he gets malchus for that. However, shelo lishmo, if during the time of Pesach, meaning the afternoon of the 14th, he has in mind shelo lishmo, and that passes the Korban Pesach, even though shelo lishmo in other korbanos would not pass the korban. In Pesach, it passes the korban, and now he owns chametz, potter, he doesn't violate the Isur. It's not just the Maisa Shechita of what is a Korban Pesach. It's a Shechita that will bring to a kosher Korban Pesach. And here, this Shechita is what we call a Shechita She'ena Re'uya, and therefore Lav Shmei Shechita, and therefore he doesn't violate the Isur of owning Chametz at the time of the Shechita. That is the initial statement of Rabbi Shimon, and then he goes on to say that Shar Kol HaZvachim, with regard to the balance of Zvachim, then let's say he shechted with ownership of Chametz on the 14th after Chatzos, is Bein Lishman or Bein Shalo Lishman Potu. Whether he shechted it Lishma, meaning for the sake of the korban, or Shalo Lishma, the halacha is that ksherim v'lo olu l'bailim l'shem chova, and therefore potu, because again Reb Shimon holds that when is he chayav for lo sishchat al chametz, that's only on a korban pesach. But if he shechts other zvachim, that's not included in this isur, and therefore even if Shalol Lishma means that the korban is kosher. Nevertheless, he doesn't violate the Isur of Lo Sishchar al Chametz because that Isur is specific and limited to the Korban Pesach. Okay, then this is where we'll stop for today, and in Mitzvah Shem, tomorrow we'll finish up the Mishna.